"Ma'am, stop resisting," he said, even though she hadn't moved an inch, and the sound of metal clicking around her wrists cut clean through the late afternoon air, like something final, something already decided before she ever opened her mouth. Naomi Carter didn't flinch when the cuffs closed, didn't pull back, didn't raise her voice. She just stood there on the edge of the sidewalk, her coat slightly damp from a light drizzle, her breath steady, eyes forward as if the moment belonged to someone else. The patrol car lights painted everything in red and blue, storefront glass, wet pavement, the faces of strangers who had already slowed down, phones half raised, curiosity louder than caution. Officer Daniel Reeves adjusted his grip, posture rigid, voice carrying just enough edge to make it clear this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was control, it was procedure, it was authority being exercised in full view. "You were told to step back," he added, like that explained everything. Like that erased the tone he'd used just seconds earlier, the kind that assumed before it asked, judged before it listened. Naomi's chin lifted a fraction, not defiant, not submissive, just level. And when she spoke, her voice didn't rise to meet his. It stayed low, even, almost quiet enough to be mistaken for calm if you weren't paying attention. "I asked a question," she said, and for a moment the space between them tightened, not with movement, but with something heavier, something unspoken. That hung there longer than it should have. A man across the street muttered under his breath. A woman beside him whispered. She shouldn't have talked back. And just like that, the narrative settled around her before she could shape it herself. Rain tapped lightly against the hood of the cruiser, a soft, steady rhythm that filled the silence Reeves didn't know how to hold. So he filled it the only way he knew how, with firmness, with repetition, with a tone that had worked 100 times before. "You people always think the rules don't apply," he said, not loud, not shouted, but clear enough that it landed harder than if he had. Naomi's eyes shifted then, not to him, but past him, catching the reflection of herself in the dark window of the patrol car, hands restrained, posture straight, face unreadable, and for a brief second something flickered there, not fear, not anger, something older, something trained into stillness long before this street. Long before this moment. A younger officer lingered a few steps back, his gaze moving from her face to the way she stood, the way she didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't collapse into the scene the way people usually did when metal touched skin like that, and it unsettled him more than resistance ever could. Reeves tightened his jaw, mistaking silence for compliance, mistaking composure for surrender, and reached for her elbow to guide her toward the back seat. The door already open, the interior dim and waiting. Naomi didn't resist, didn't step away, but she didn't rush either. Each movement measured, deliberate, like she was choosing every inch of space she occupied. The city kept moving around them, cars passing, conversations resuming, a distant siren blending into the background. But right there, on that strip of wet concrete, time seemed to hold its breath, stretched thin between what had just happened and something that hadn't yet revealed itself. "You're making a mistake," she said, not as a warning, not as a threat, just a statement placed carefully into the air. And for the first time since the cuffs clicked shut, Reeves hesitated, not enough to stop, not enough to question, but just enough for doubt to brush past him before he pushed it aside and continued like nothing had changed. The back door of the patrol car opened with a dull mechanical thud, the kind that felt heavier than it sounded, and Naomi Carter lowered herself onto the seat without being pushed, without needing guidance, her movements controlled, deliberate, like she had done this before in a different life, under different circumstances, where observation mattered more than reaction. The vinyl seat was cold through her coat, carrying the faint smell of disinfectant and something older, something that lingered in spaces where stories were never fully told. And when the door shut behind her, the outside noise softened into a muffled hum. Lights still flashing through the glass like a pulse that refused to settle. Officer Daniel Reeves circled to the driver's side, his radio crackling softly against his shoulder as he slid into place, posture still rigid, jaw set as though the situation had already been categorized, processed, filed away as routine. And yet his eyes flicked once toward the rearview mirror, just once, catching Naomi's reflection sitting upright, hands still, gaze steady, not scanning, not searching, just present in a way that unsettled him without giving him a reason. The younger officer lingered outside for a second longer before stepping closer to the window, his voice lower now, almost cautious. "Sir, do we want to run her information first?" And Reeves did not answer immediately, his fingers tapping once against the steering wheel. Once, before he reached for the onboard tablet mounted near the dash, the screen lighting up his face in a pale blue glow that made the moment feel more procedural than it actually was. Naomi shifted slightly, the soft clink of the cuffs barely audible over the radio chatter, and when she spoke again her voice carried through the small space without force, without urgency. "You should," she said, not as a suggestion but as a statement placed carefully where it could not be ignored, and the younger officer glanced at her, then back at Reeves, something unspoken passing between them before Reeves finally exhaled through his nose and began typing. Outside, a small crowd had formed, not large enough to block the street, but enough to create that familiar circle of attention, people standing just far enough away to feel uninvolved, phones raised just high enough to capture what they believed was another ordinary moment, another interaction that fit into a pattern they had already decided how to interpret. Inside the car, the tablet processed slowly, each second stretching just a little longer than it should have, and Reeves shifted in his seat, irritation flickering beneath his controlled exterior. "Name," he said without turning. The word clipped, efficient, and Naomi did not answer immediately, not because she was refusing, but because she seemed to be measuring something, weighing timing against outcome, before she finally spoke. "Naomi Carter." And the way she said it carried no emphasis, no expectation that it would mean anything to him, just the truth delivered plainly. Reeves entered the name, his fingers moving faster now, more confident, and for a moment nothing happened, just the soft hum of the system, the quiet rhythm of rain tapping against the roof, the distant murmur of voices outside, and then the screen refreshed, a subtle shift, a change in layout that Reeves almost missed until his eyes caught a line that did not belong in his usual field of view, something that made his hand pause mid-motion, not fully stopping, just slowing enough to register that something was different. The younger officer leaned slightly toward the open window, trying to read the screen from where he stood, but Reeves angled it away instinctively, a reflex he did not fully understand, as if the information had suddenly become something that needed to be contained, controlled, kept within the boundaries of his authority. Naomi watched the movement through the reflection in the glass, her expression unchanged, her breathing still even, but there was a subtle shift in the way she held herself now. Not larger, not more imposing, just more certain, like a piece of a puzzle had quietly fallen into place. Reeves cleared his throat, the sound more deliberate than necessary, and continued scrolling, each new line adding weight to a realization he was not ready to articulate. Not yet, not in front of the crowd, not in front of his partner, and definitely not in front of the woman sitting behind him who had not raised her voice once since the cuffs had closed. "Step out for a second," he said to the younger officer, his tone controlled but tighter now, and the officer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before nodding and stepping back, the door closing with a softer click this time, leaving Reeves alone with the hum of the engine, the glow of the screen, and the quiet presence in the back seat that no longer felt like a routine stop. Naomi tilted her head slightly, not enough to seem confrontational, just enough to meet his eyes in the mirror again. And when she spoke her voice carried the same calm it had from the beginning, unchanged by the shift in atmosphere, unchanged by the tension that had begun to thread through the air. "I told you," she said, not with satisfaction, not with accusation, just a quiet acknowledgement of a moment that was starting to turn, whether he was ready for it or not. Reeves stared at the screen a second longer than he should have, the glow reflecting in his eyes as if it might rearrange itself into something simpler if he just waited. But it did not. It stayed exactly as it was, clear, official, undeniable, and his fingers hovered over the tablet without touching it, like contact might make it more real. Outside, the murmur of voices thickened as more people slowed their steps, the faint sound of a car passing through a shallow puddle, sending a soft spray across the curb, ordinary sounds that felt strangely distant inside the sealed space of the patrol car. Naomi Carter remained still in the back seat, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, not watching him directly, but aware of every shift in the air between them. every hesitation that had not been there before. Reeves finally cleared his throat again, softer this time, almost as if he was reminding himself that he was still in control of something. And he tapped the screen once more, scrolling, confirming, searching for a detail that might contradict what he had already seen, but each line only reinforced it, each entry carrying weight, rank, history, things that did not belong in the back seat of a city patrol car on a wet afternoon. He leaned back slightly, just enough for the seat to creak under his weight, and exhaled through his nose, the sound quiet but deliberate, then reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder, his hand pausing halfway as if he was reconsidering who exactly he needed to involve and how quickly this could escalate beyond him. Naomi's voice came again, not interrupting, not pushing, simply entering the space at the exact moment his hesitation peaked. "You are going to want to make that call," she said, and there was no urgency in it, no edge, just clarity, the kind that did not need volume to carry weight. Reeves did not respond immediately, his eyes flicking once more to the mirror, meeting hers for a brief second before shifting away, and that brief contact felt different now, no longer an assessment of a situation, but an acknowledgement of something he had not accounted for. Outside, the younger officer shifted his stance, glancing toward the growing crowd and then back toward the car, uncertainty beginning to replace the earlier confidence in his posture, his hands resting loosely near his belt as if he was waiting for direction that had not yet come. Reeves finally pressed the radio button, his voice lower than before, controlled but tightened by something he could not quite mask. "Dispatch. Run a priority verification," he said, the words measured, each one placed carefully, and there was a slight pause on the other end, just long enough to suggest that the request itself was out of the ordinary, before the acknowledgement came through. With a faint crackle, Naomi shifted her gaze toward the side window, watching the blurred reflections of red and blue lights ripple across the glass, her own reflection layered over them, steady, unchanged, as if the moment unfolding was simply another variable in a longer equation she had already solved. Reeves tapped the tablet again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if he was buying time, and the seconds stretched, each one carrying more weight than the last, until the radio came alive. Again, the tone different now, sharper, more alert. "Unit, confirm location and subject," the voice said, and Reeves straightened slightly, giving the details, his words precise, professional, but there was a subtle shift in his cadence, a fraction of a beat where confidence used to sit. The response that followed did not come immediately, and that silence pressed in, heavier than the noise outside, heavier than the rain, heavier than the expectations that had shaped the moment from the beginning. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, not in fatigue, not in resignation, just a single measured breath in and out, and when she opened them again nothing about her expression had changed, but the air in the car had something invisible but undeniable, like pressure building before a storm. Reeves adjusted his grip on the radio, his thumb resting against the button without pressing it, and for the first time since the cuffs had clicked into place, his certainty began to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet crack beneath the surface that spread with every passing second. Outside, someone in the crowd said something louder than before, a voice rising above the others, and a few heads turned, attention sharpening, sensing that whatever this was, it was no longer ordinary. Inside the car, the tablet screen dimmed slightly before brightening again, and Reeves glanced down instinctively, as if afraid to miss something, as if the next update might change everything or confirm that it already had. Naomi leaned back just enough for the faintest sound of the seat shifting beneath her, her hands still restrained but her posture unchanged, and when she spoke again, it was softer than before, almost reflective. "There is still time to handle this the right way," she said, not offering an escape, not demanding anything, just placing the possibility in front of him like a door he could choose to open or ignore. Reeves did not answer, but his silence was no longer the same. It carried weight now, hesitation, calculation, and something else he had not yet named, something that would not stay buried much longer as the radio crackled again, louder this time, sharper, carrying a tone that did not belong to routine calls, a tone that meant this was already moving beyond him whether he was ready or not. The radio burst through the silence with a sharper edge this time, the kind of tone that cut straight through routine and left no room for misinterpretation. "Unit, hold your position," the dispatcher said, voice tighter than before, and that alone was enough to shift something in the air, something subtle but undeniable. Reeves straightened in his seat, his hand tightening slightly around the radio as he responded, "Copy that." But his voice did not carry the same certainty it had earlier. There was a slight delay, a fraction of a second where control had to be gathered. Instead of assumed, outside, the younger officer stepped closer to the driver's side window, his brows pulled together, reading the change without needing it explained. "What is going on?" he asked, low enough that the crowd could not hear, but close enough that the question lingered inside the car even after the words faded. Reeves did not answer immediately, his eyes flicking once more to the tablet, then to the mirror, then back to the radio, as if each one might offer a different version of reality, one that aligned better with what he had expected this shift to be. Naomi Carter remained still in the back seat, her hands resting where the cuffs held them, her posture unchanged, but there was a quiet awareness in her gaze now, not anticipation, not satisfaction, just recognition of a moment reaching its natural turning point. The dispatcher's voice returned, more urgent, more direct. "Unit, confirm the subject remains secured and do not proceed with transport." And this time there was no pause between the words, no buffer, just instruction delivered clean and immediate. Reeves swallowed once, the motion small but visible in the mirror, and he responded again, affirmative. But the word felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more weight than a simple confirmation. Outside, the crowd had grown by a few more people, phones now fully raised, whispers turning into quiet speculation, the kind that spread quickly when something felt just slightly out of place, just different enough to hold attention. The younger officer shifted again, his stance no longer relaxed, his gaze moving between Reeves and the back seat, trying to reconcile the calm presence inside with the escalating tone on the radio. "Sir," he said again, a little firmer this time, "should we uncuff her?" And the question hung there, not defiant, not challenging, just uncertain, searching for direction that no longer felt obvious. Reeves did not respond right away, his fingers hovering near the radio, then pulling back, then resting on the steering wheel as if grounding himself in something physical might steady the moment. Inside the car, the hum of the engine seemed louder now, the faint vibration traveling through the seats, through the floor, through the space between them, filling the silence that no one was quite sure how to break. Naomi turned her head slightly toward the window, watching the blurred reflection of the officer outside, the tension in his posture, the way uncertainty had begun to replace assumption, and when she spoke again her voice carried the same, even tone it had from the beginning. "You already know the answer," she said, not directed at anyone in particular, but it landed anyway, settling into the space like a truth that did not need to be argued. Reeves exhaled slowly, the sound measured, controlled, and he finally reached for the radio again, pressing the button with a deliberate motion. "Dispatch, advise," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of earlier sharpness, and the response came almost immediately this time, faster than before, sharper. "Unit, remain on scene, supervisory en route, and stand by for further instruction." And there it was, the shift made official. The situation no longer contained within a single officer's judgment. Reeves nodded once, though no one on the other end could see it, and released the button, his hand lingering on the radio for a second longer before dropping to his lap. Outside, the younger officer took a step back, processing the update without being told, his posture adjusting, less assertive, more observant, like he had stepped out of the center of something and into its edge. Inside, Naomi leaned back just slightly, the smallest adjustment, but it changed the way the light from the flashing patrol car reflected across her face, softening the angles, revealing nothing and everything at the same time. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the roof, unchanged by the shift in tone, unchanged by the shift in power, a quiet reminder that the world outside this moment kept moving whether they were ready or not. Reeves glanced at the mirror again, and this time he did not look away as quickly, holding the reflection for a fraction longer, long enough to recognize that whatever he thought this was at the beginning, It was no longer that, and had not been for some time. Naomi met his gaze without expression, without challenge, just presence. And in that brief connection something settled between them, not agreement, not resolution, but acknowledgement that the moment had moved beyond the version either of them had first stepped into. The radio remained silent for a few seconds after the last transmission, but the absence of sound felt louder than anything that had come through it, like the calm before something inevitable, something already in motion and closing the distance with every passing second. The silence after the last transmission did not last long, but it stretched just enough to make every second feel deliberate, like the air itself was waiting for something to arrive and settle what had already begun to shift. Reeves adjusted in his seat again, not out of comfort, but out of habit, the kind of movement meant to re-establish control, even when control had started to slip in ways he could not fully explain. And his eyes drifted once more to the tablet, then to the mirror, then to the street beyond the windshield where the crowd now stood a little closer than before, drawn in by the subtle change in tone they could not quite name, but could clearly feel. The younger officer stepped back toward the driver's side, his voice lower now, careful. "Supervisor is on the way," he said, as if saying it out loud might make the situation more stable, more defined. But it only added another layer to something that had already moved beyond simple definition. Naomi Carter remained in the back seat, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that no longer blended into the background of the scene, but quietly anchored it. And when she shifted her hands slightly, the soft sound of metal against metal seemed louder than before, not because it had changed, but because everything else had. Reeves reached for the door handle, but did not open it right away, his fingers resting there for a moment, as if he was deciding how to step out of the role he had assumed minutes earlier, and into whatever this was becoming. And when he finally opened the door, the outside air carried in the faint scent of rain and asphalt, grounding, real, immediate. He stepped out and closed the door behind him with controlled precision, turning toward the younger officer who was already watching him, waiting, and for a second neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with the weight of what had not yet been said. "We are holding," Reeves said finally, his tone measured, stripped of the earlier edge, and the younger officer nodded, though his expression carried questions that had not yet found words. A black sedan slowed as it approached the scene, not stopping, just passing by at a reduced speed, the driver glancing over with the same curiosity as the others, and Reeves felt that glance in a way he had not felt earlier, like it was no longer just observation but evaluation. Inside the car, Naomi turned her head slightly, watching through the window as Reeves spoke, her gaze steady, not following his movements exactly but aware of the shift in them. The subtle changes that signaled something internal had already begun to adjust. The radio on Reeves's shoulder crackled again, louder now, sharper, and he reached for it immediately, pressing the button with less hesitation than before. "Unit ready," he said, and the response came without delay, direct and unmistakable. "Supervisor is 2 minutes out. Remain compliant and do not escalate." And the phrasing hung there, specific, intentional, a directive that acknowledged more than it explained. Reeves released the button slowly, his hand dropping back to his side, and he glanced toward the patrol car, toward the figure in the back seat who had not once raised her voice, who had not once broken composure, and that contrast pressed against everything he had assumed at the beginning of this stop. The younger officer followed his gaze, then looked back at him, and this time he did speak the question that had been building. "Sir, who is she?" And Reeves did not answer right away, not because he did not know anymore, but because saying it out loud would make it real in a way. The screen alone had not. He exhaled once, steady, then said quietly, "Someone we should have listened to." And the words settled between them, shifting the dynamic in a way neither of them could ignore. Inside the car, Naomi leaned back slightly, the faint reflection of the flashing lights moving across her face in slow, rhythmic patterns, and for a moment her eyes closed, just a brief pause, a measured breath in and out, before opening again with the same calm clarity as before. The sound of an approaching engine grew louder from down the street, distinct from the others, purposeful, and heads in the crowd began to turn in that direction. Attention shifting, anticipation building in a way that felt almost synchronized. Reeves straightened his posture instinctively, Though the gesture no longer carried the same authority it had earlier, now it felt more like preparation, like bracing for something he could not control but needed to face. The younger officer stepped back a half pace, creating space without being told, his stance more neutral now, less assertive, as if he too understood that whatever came next would not follow the script they had started with. Inside the car, Naomi's gaze moved toward the approaching sound, not hurried, not tense, just aware, and when the first glimpse of the incoming vehicle reflected faintly in the side mirror, something in the atmosphere settled into place, not with noise, not with force, but with quiet inevitability. Reeves looked toward the street, then back at the car, then finally at his own hands for a brief second before lifting his gaze again. And in that small moment, it was clear that the version of control he had started with was gone, replaced by something heavier, something that required more than command, something that required acknowledgement, and the distance between what had been and what was about to be felt shorter with every passing second as the approaching vehicle drew closer and the scene, once ordinary, now waited for its next shift. The approaching engine did not rush. It rolled forward with a controlled, deliberate pace, the kind that did not need urgency to command attention. And as the dark SUV turned the corner, its headlights cut clean lines through the damp air, reflecting off the wet pavement in long, steady streaks that seemed to slow everything else down. Conversations in the crowd lowered. Without anyone being told, phones remained raised, but movements became smaller, quieter, as if instinctively people understood that whatever had been unfolding was about to shift into something more defined, something that carried weight beyond speculation. Reeves squared his shoulders, not sharply this time, not with the same rigid authority as before, but with a quieter adjustment, one that looked more like preparation than control, and his eyes tracked the vehicle as it came to a smooth stop. Just behind the patrol car, the engine idled low, steady, and for a second no one moved, the pause stretching thin before the driver's side door opened and Captain Laura Whitman stepped out, her presence calm but unmistakable, the kind of authority that did not need to announce itself because it was already understood. Her shoes met the pavement with measured steps, each one even, unhurried, and she glanced once at the crowd, once at the patrol car, taking in the scene in a single sweep before. Her gaze settled on Reeves. "Officer," she said, her tone level, not raised, but carrying enough clarity to cut through the remaining noise, and Reeves responded immediately. "Captain," his voice controlled, though the earlier sharpness had softened into something more careful. The younger officer stepped back another half step, creating space without instruction, his posture shifting into something more observant, less central, as if he already knew his role had changed. Inside the patrol car, Naomi Carter watched through the slightly tinted glass, her eyes following the exchange without urgency, her posture still grounded, unchanged by the arrival, as though this moment had already been accounted for long before the SUV turned the corner. Whitman's gaze moved past Reeves to the back seat of the patrol car, her expression tightening just slightly, not enough for the crowd to notice, but enough for Reeves to catch the shift. And in that fraction of a second something unspoken passed. Between them, something that did not require explanation but carried immediate consequence. "Explain," Whitman said, a single word, precise, leaving no room for excess, and Reeves drew in a breath before speaking, his explanation measured, stripped down to sequence and observation. But even as he spoke, there was a subtle awareness that the structure he relied on was no longer enough to contain what had happened. Whitman listened without interruption, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the car, toward Naomi, then back to Reeves, and when he finished there was a brief silence, not empty, but filled with evaluation, the kind that did not rush because it did not need to. She stepped closer to the rear door of the patrol car, her movement steady, deliberate, and when she reached for the handle, she paused for just a fraction of a second, as if aligning her response with something beyond the immediate scene. Before opening it, the door swung outward with a soft mechanical sound, and the interior of the car opened into the gray afternoon light, revealing Naomi seated exactly as before, composed, still, present. For a moment Whitman did not speak, her eyes meeting Naomi's, and in that brief exchange the dynamic shifted again, quieter this time, but deeper, as recognition settled into place. "Ma'am," Whitman said finally, her voice lower now, carrying a respect that had not been present at the start of the scene, and Naomi inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, not exaggerated, not formal, just enough to meet the moment without expanding it. Reeves stood a few feet away, watching, his posture no longer rigid, his stance less defined, as if he had stepped out of the center of something and into its consequence. The crowd remained silent, the earlier whispers replaced by a focused stillness, phones capturing not just the action now, but the shift in tone, the change in how people spoke, how they stood, how they waited. Whitman glanced briefly at the cuffs, then back at Naomi, and the smallest tightening in her expression returned, more controlled this time, more contained, but unmistakable. "We are going to correct this," she said, not loudly, not for the crowd, but clearly enough that Reeves heard it, that the younger officer heard it, that the weight of those words settled exactly where it needed to. Naomi did not respond immediately, her gaze steady, her breathing even, and when she finally spoke it was with the same calm clarity that had carried through every moment so far. "That would be appropriate," she said, her tone neither approving nor dismissive, just aligned with the truth of the situation as it now stood. Whitman nodded once, a small, controlled movement, then shifted her attention back to Reeves, and in that glance there was no anger, no raised voice, just something far more precise, something that carried expectation, accountability, and the quiet understanding that what had begun minutes ago was no longer a simple interaction. It was something that would follow them beyond this street, beyond this moment. The rain continued to fall in light, steady taps against metal and glass, unchanged by the presence of rank, unchanged by the shifting weight of authority, and as Whitman stepped slightly aside to create space at the open door, the scene held its breath again, not in tension this time, but in anticipation of the next decision, the one that would define everything that followed. Whitman stepped closer to the open door, her hand resting lightly on the frame, not blocking the exit, not asserting control, just anchoring the moment. And for a brief second no one moved, the rain filling the silence with its steady rhythm, as if marking time in a way none of them could interrupt. Naomi Carter shifted her gaze from Whitman to the space beyond her, the street, the crowd, the officers standing just outside the circle of what had now become something far more than a routine stop. And then back again, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed despite the metal around her wrists. Whitman glanced once more at the cuffs, then reached forward with a controlled, deliberate motion, her voice quiet but unmistakably firm. "I am going to remove these," she said, not asking, not seeking permission, but acknowledging the correction that needed to happen, and Naomi gave the slightest nod, a simple acceptance. Nothing more. The faint click of the release mechanism sounded, softer than expected, almost swallowed by the rain, and as the tension on Naomi's wrists eased, she did not pull away immediately, did not rush the moment. She simply let her hands rest for a second longer before bringing them forward, slow, steady, like she was reintroducing movement back into a space that had been defined by stillness. Reeves stood a few steps back, watching, his posture no longer rigid, his shoulders slightly lowered, as if the weight of what had unfolded had settled into him in a way he could not shake. And when the cuffs came free, his eyes dropped briefly, not in avoidance, but in recognition of a moment that had already shifted beyond his control. The younger officer remained quiet, his stance neutral now, his earlier certainty replaced by careful observation, his gaze moving between Whitman and Naomi, as if trying to understand how something so simple could carry so much consequence. Naomi flexed her fingers once, the motion small, controlled, and then rested her hands in her lap for a brief second before placing them lightly against the edge of the seat, grounding herself in the physical space. Without drawing attention to it, Whitman stepped back half a pace, creating room, her voice lowering further. "You are free to step out," she said. And again Naomi did not rush. She shifted forward with measured ease, her shoes touching the wet pavement with a quiet, deliberate step that seemed to echo louder than it should have, not because of sound, but because of what it represented. The crowd leaned in just slightly, phones steady, capturing not just the action but the tone, the shift, the quiet reversal that had unfolded without raised voices or dramatic gestures. Naomi straightened as she stood, her coat falling naturally into place, the lines of her posture aligning with something deeper than the moment, something trained, something carried long before this street. And when she lifted her head, her gaze moved across the scene once, taking in the officers, the captain, the crowd, not with judgment, not with anger, just awareness. Whitman turned slightly toward Reeves, her expression controlled, her voice low enough that it did not carry to the crowd but firm enough that it landed exactly where it needed to. "We will address this properly," she said, and Reeves nodded once. The motion restrained, his voice quieter than before. "Yes, Captain," the words coming without resistance but carrying the weight of acknowledgement. Naomi adjusted her sleeve where the cuff had rested, smoothing the fabric with a simple motion, then let her hands fall naturally at her sides, her breathing steady, unchanged, and when she spoke her voice carried the same calm clarity that had defined every moment so far. "I would like to make a call," she said, not as a demand, not as leverage, just a continuation of something already in motion. Whitman inclined her head slightly, stepping aside further to give her space. "Of course," she replied, and the simplicity of the response contrasted sharply with the complexity of what it represented. Reeves glanced once at the radio on his shoulder, then at Naomi, then back toward Whitman, as if piecing together the sequence of events in a way that now felt incomplete, and the distance between what he had assumed at the start and what stood in front of him now felt wider than he could measure. Naomi reached into her coat pocket, retrieving her phone with steady hands. No urgency, no hesitation, and as she unlocked it, the faint glow of the screen reflected briefly in her eyes, a small, controlled light in the gray afternoon. The rain continued, soft, consistent, tapping against metal and pavement, indifferent to rank, indifferent to consequence. And as Naomi lifted the phone to her ear, the entire scene seemed to settle into a quiet stillness, not forced, not commanded, but earned through the weight of what had already unfolded. No one spoke, not Whitman, not Reeves, not the younger officer, and even the crowd seemed to hold back, as if instinctively understanding that whatever came next would not need volume to carry its impact. And Naomi, standing there with calm precision, simply waited for the line to connect, her posture steady, her presence unchanged, as the moment prepared to shift once again. The call connected on the second ring, not rushed, not delayed, just precise, and Naomi Carter did not raise her voice when she spoke, did not step away from the scene. She simply turned slightly, so the rain brushed softly against her shoulder, and said, "This is General Naomi Carter." The words landing clean, without emphasis, without explanation, but the effect was immediate, not in sound, but in presence. Whitman's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her chin lowering just a fraction as if aligning with something she already understood, while Reeves stood still, his eyes fixed on Naomi, the titles settling into him in a way that no screen, no record, had fully done before. The voice on the other end responded. Quickly, too quickly for it to be coincidence. The tone professional but edged with recognition, and Naomi listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her gaze steady on a point just beyond the patrol car, as if the street itself had become secondary to the line she held. "Location confirmed," she said after a brief pause, her words measured, each one placed exactly where it needed to be. And then she fell silent again, listening, absorbing, not reacting outwardly to whatever was being said, but something in the stillness around her deepened, as if the call itself had shifted the center of gravity in the scene. The crowd did not understand the words, but they felt the change, the subtle tightening of posture, the way Whitman now stood slightly to the side rather than in front, the way Reeves no longer held the space but occupied it cautiously, aware that it no longer belonged to him. The younger officer glanced between them, his earlier questions now replaced by a quiet awareness that something far larger than a routine call was unfolding in front of him, something that did not need explanation to be understood. Naomi spoke again, her voice calm. "Yes, sir." And then a pause, a slight nod, almost imperceptible, before she added, "I will remain on site," and ended the call with a simple motion, lowering the phone without looking at it, without checking the screen, as if the conversation had already resolved everything it needed to. The silence that followed was different now, not uncertain, not tense, but settled, like a decision had been made somewhere beyond the street, beyond the officers, beyond the visible frame of the moment, and that decision was already moving toward them. Whitman exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, and stepped forward just enough to close the distance between herself and Naomi, her voice low, respectful. "General," she said, the title no longer implied, no longer uncertain, and Naomi inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, not formal, not exaggerated, just enough to meet the shift without expanding it. Reeves looked down briefly, then back up, his posture adjusting again, not to assert control, but to stand correctly, within something he now understood differently. And when he spoke, his voice carried none of the earlier edge. "Ma'am," he said, the word careful, deliberate, and it lingered in the air longer than expected, carrying weight that had not been there before. Naomi did not respond immediately, her gaze moving once across the scene, taking in the officers, the captain, the crowd, the vehicles, and then returning to stillness, as if placing everything back into its proper context. The radio on. Reeves's shoulder crackled again, but this time he did not reach for it right away. He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before pressing the button, his voice lower, steadier. "Unit standing by." And the response came through sharper than before, layered with urgency that could not be mistaken. "Command has been notified. Remain in place and await further instruction." And the words settled into the space like a final confirmation of what had already begun. Whitman's eyes shifted, briefly toward Reeves, then back to Naomi, her expression controlled but unmistakably altered, the kind of change that came not from surprise but from alignment with something higher, something that required immediate correction without question. The rain continued its quiet rhythm, tapping against metal and glass, indifferent to the shift in authority, indifferent to the weight of titles now spoken aloud, and the crowd, sensing the change even without understanding it, grew quieter, their movements smaller, their voices lower, as if instinctively respecting the gravity of the moment. Naomi stood there, calm, grounded, her phone resting lightly in her hand, her presence unchanged despite everything that had shifted around her. And in that stillness it became clear that the power in the scene had not arrived with the call. It had been there from the beginning, steady, patient, waiting for recognition rather than announcement. Reeves glanced once more at the ground near his feet, then back up, his jaw tightening slightly before relaxing. And in that small motion something settled, not resolution, not relief, but understanding. The kind that comes too late to change what has happened, but just in time to change what comes next. Whitman took a half step back, giving Naomi space without stepping away from responsibility, her voice quiet but firm. "We will handle this correctly," she said. And this time the words carried not just intention, but obligation, anchored by the call that had already moved beyond them. The scene held steady, the rain falling, the lights reflecting, the crowd watching. But beneath it all something irreversible had taken place, something that did not need volume, did not need force, just a name, a call, and the quiet certainty of someone who never needed to prove who she was in the first place. The air no longer felt uncertain, it felt directed, like something unseen had taken hold of the moment and was quietly guiding it forward. And Naomi Carter did not move from where she stood, her posture grounded, her presence steady as the rain traced soft lines down her coat and gathered at the edges of the pavement. Captain Laura Whitman remained a step behind her now, not leading, not intercepting, but aligning, her stance reflecting a shift that no longer needed to be explained out loud. Officer Daniel Reeves stood facing them, his hands no longer fixed at his sides but resting loosely, as if he had stepped out of the rigid frame he had held earlier and into something more uncertain, something that required attention rather than assumption. The radio crackled again, sharper this time, carrying a tone that made the younger officer straighten instinctively, and Reeves responded immediately, his voice steady but quieter than before. "Unit standing by," and the reply came through. Without delay, direct, controlled, command requests full identification. Confirmation and status update, supervisory channel only. The words precise, leaving no room for interpretation. Reeves glanced at Whitman, then at Naomi, then back to the radio, as if measuring the sequence of response, and Whitman gave a slight nod, A minimal motion that carried clear instruction, and Reeves stepped a half-pace away, turning slightly to create distance from the crowd before pressing the button again. His voice lowered further, subject identified as General Naomi Carter. Status corrected, standing by for directive. And even as he spoke the words, something in his posture shifted again, the title no longer abstract, no longer confined to a screen, but fully present in the space between them. The younger officer watched closely, his earlier uncertainty now replaced by focused attention. His eyes moving between Reeves and Naomi as if trying to understand how quickly a situation could transform without any visible force. The response from command did not come immediately this time, and the silence that followed carried a different weight, not hesitation, but calculation, like something larger was aligning beyond their view. Naomi remained still, her gaze steady, not following the exchange but aware of every word, every pause, her presence unchanged, as if the outcome had already been accepted long before the question was asked. Whitman folded her hands lightly in front of her, a composed stance that mirrored Naomi's stillness without copying it, and when she spoke her voice was quiet, directed toward Reeves but shaped by the moment itself. "We will document everything from the beginning," she said, not as a suggestion, but as a necessary step, and Reeves nodded once, the motion firm, grounded, his earlier hesitation replaced by a more deliberate awareness of what needed to be done next. The crowd had grown quieter now, the initial curiosity replaced by a kind of focused observation, phones still raised but movements minimal, as if everyone sensed that this was no longer something to react to, but something to witness. A passing car slowed again, its headlights sweeping briefly across the scene before continuing on, the driver glancing once, then looking forward, as if recognizing that this moment belonged to something beyond ordinary interruption. The radio came alive once more, this time with a tone that cut through even the steady rhythm of the rain. "Unit, remain in place. Additional command liaison en route. No further action until arrival." And Reeves listened carefully, his hand steady on the radio, his response immediate. Affirmative. The word clear, controlled, and when he released the button his shoulders lowered slightly, not in relief, but in acceptance of a process now fully outside his initial control. Naomi shifted her weight subtly, the smallest adjustment, her shoes pressing lightly against the damp pavement, grounding her in the physical moment even as the situation extended far beyond it. And she glanced briefly at Whitman, a quiet acknowledgement that carried no tension, no demand, just presence. Whitman met the glance with a slight nod, her expression composed, her posture steady, and in that brief exchange something settled between them, not spoken, not formal, but understood. Reeves looked toward Naomi again, his gaze no longer defensive, no longer uncertain, but measured, as if he was recalibrating his understanding of everything that had led to this point. And when he spoke his voice carried a quiet restraint. "Ma'am, we will ensure this is addressed properly." The words careful, chosen, and they lingered in the air longer than expected, not because of their sound, but because of their meaning. Naomi inclined her head slightly, the motion subtle, acknowledging without expanding, and then returned her gaze forward, her posture unchanged, her presence steady as the rain continued its soft, consistent rhythm. The younger officer exhaled quietly, a sound barely audible, but it carried a release of tension that had built without him realizing it, and he adjusted his stance once more, now fully aligned with the shift that had taken place. The scene held steady, not frozen, but settled, like a new balance had been reached, one that no longer relied on assumption or force, but on recognition, on correction, on the quiet understanding that some moments do not need escalation to change everything. They only need to be seen clearly for what they are. And as the distant sound of another approaching vehicle began to rise beneath the rain, faint at first, then more distinct, it became clear that this moment, already transformed, was not yet finished, that what had begun on this street was continuing to unfold, step by step, with a precision that no one present could ignore. The second vehicle approached with more intention than the first, its headlights steady, its speed controlled, and as it came into view the subtle shift in the crowd was immediate. People stepping slightly aside without being told, voices lowering further, attention narrowing to the space where everything had already begun to change. The dark government sedan rolled to a smooth stop just behind Whitman's SUV, engine humming low. And for a brief second no one moved, the rain continuing its quiet rhythm as if marking the transition from one phase of the moment to the next. Reeves straightened again, not sharply, not with the rigid authority from earlier, but with a more deliberate awareness, as if he understood now that posture alone did not define position, and his eyes tracked the rear door of the arriving vehicle as it opened with controlled precision. A man stepped out, dressed in a dark overcoat, his presence understated but unmistakably aligned with something higher than the immediate scene, his gaze moving once across the officers, the crowd, the vehicles, and then settling on Naomi Carter with a recognition that required no introduction. Whitman shifted slightly to the side, her stance aligning with his arrival, her voice low but clear. "Sir," she said, and the man acknowledged her with a brief nod before stepping forward, his shoes meeting the wet pavement with measured steps that carried no urgency but left no doubt about purpose. Naomi remained still, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady as he approached, and when he stopped a few feet away there was a brief moment where neither of them spoke, not out of hesitation, but out of mutual understanding that did not need to be rushed. "General Carter," he said finally, his voice even, precise, and Naomi inclined her head slightly in response. "Yes," she said, her tone unchanged, as if the confirmation was simply a continuation of what had already been established. The man glanced once toward Whitman, then toward Reeves, his expression composed, but there was a subtle tightening around his eyes, not anger, not frustration, but evaluation, the kind that cataloged details without announcing judgment. Reeves felt that glance in a way he had not felt anything earlier, not as confrontation, but as assessment, and he held his position, his hands still, his posture steady, understanding that whatever came next would not be shaped by him. The younger officer stood quietly now, fully removed from the center of the moment, his earlier questions replaced by a focused stillness, his attention fixed on the exchange unfolding in front of him. The man turned his attention back to Naomi, his voice lowering slightly. "We received your call," he said, and Naomi nodded once, a simple acknowledgement. "I believed it was necessary," she replied, her words measured, carrying no emphasis beyond their clarity. The man's gaze shifted briefly to her wrists, then back to her face, and that small motion carried more weight than any spoken reaction. The absence of the cuffs now more significant than their presence had been minutes earlier. Whitman spoke then, her voice controlled, directed. "We have already begun corrective steps," she said, and the man acknowledged her with another brief nod, his attention returning to Reeves, and for a moment the space between them held a quiet tension, not aggressive, not confrontational, but precise, like a line being drawn without being named. Reeves drew in a slow breath, his voice steady when he spoke. "Sir, the situation has been corrected, and we are prepared to provide a full report." The words deliberate, stripped of any attempt to justify, focused only on what could still be addressed. The man studied him for a second longer than expected, not speaking immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any immediate response could have, before he finally said, "You will," his tone even, leaving no room for interpretation. The rain continued to fall in soft, steady taps against the vehicles, the pavement, the edges of the moment, indifferent to the hierarchy now fully present, indifferent to the quiet shift that had taken place from assumption to accountability. The crowd remained still, phones raised but movements minimal, as if everyone understood that this was no longer a moment to react to, but one to witness in silence. Naomi stood centered within it all, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, not elevated by the arrival, not altered by the recognition, just consistent, as if everything unfolding around her was simply aligning with something that had always been true. The man stepped slightly to the side, creating a subtle opening in the formation, his voice calm as he addressed Whitman. "We will proceed from here," and she nodded, her stance shifting again, not stepping away, but repositioning to support rather than lead. Reeves lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, his expression controlled, his posture grounded in a way that felt different from before, less about authority, more about understanding the weight of what had already occurred. The younger officer exhaled quietly, the sound barely audible beneath the rain, but it marked a release of something unspoken, something that had built and now settled into the reality of the moment. The scene held steady once more, not frozen, not tense, but resolved in a way that did not require loud declarations, only presence, acknowledgement, and the quiet certainty that what had been set in motion would carry forward beyond the street, beyond the flashing lights, into consequences that no one present could fully see yet, but all of them now understood were inevitable. The man from the government sedan did not raise his voice, did not step closer than necessary, but the space around him seemed to reorganize itself anyway, like gravity had shifted without warning, and Naomi Carter stood within that shift without reacting to it, her posture steady, her gaze level, as if nothing about this moment required her to change. Captain Laura Whitman adjusted her stance slightly, aligning herself just behind and to the side of Naomi, no longer positioned between her and the officers, but beside the truth of what had already been revealed, her presence quiet but fully accountable. Officer Daniel Reeves remained where he was, the distance between him and Naomi no longer physical but defined by something heavier, something that had settled into the air the moment the cuffs came off, and he could feel it in the way he held his shoulders, in the way his breath moved slower now, more deliberate. The man glanced once more at Naomi, then toward the street beyond. Her, taking in the crowd, the vehicles, the quiet attention that had gathered without being invited. And when he spoke again, his tone remained even. "General, we will ensure full documentation and review." The words precise, not exaggerated, and Naomi nodded once, her voice calm as she responded, "That is all I require." Not demanding more, not extending the moment beyond what it needed to be. The simplicity of her response carried weight, not because of what it asked for, but because of what it did not, and Whitman seemed to register that, her expression tightening just slightly before settling again into control. Reeves shifted his weight once, a small movement, but it broke the stillness around him just enough for the younger officer to glance over, and for a second their eyes met, not in confusion anymore, but in shared awareness that something irreversible had already taken place. The radio remained quiet now, no longer the center of urgency, but a tool waiting for the next instruction, and the absence of its noise made everything else clearer. The rain, the distant hum of traffic, the quiet breathing of people standing too close to something they did not fully understand but could not walk away from. Naomi looked down briefly at her hands, not checking them, not reacting, just acknowledging the absence of what had been there minutes ago, and then lifted her gaze again, steady, grounded, her presence unchanged by the correction, as if dignity did not arrive with recognition but had been carried the entire time. The man took a small step back, not retreating, but repositioning, creating space around Naomi rather than closing it. And that shift did not go unnoticed, not by Whitman, not by Reeves, not by the crowd that now stood in quiet observation, sensing that something important had just been restored. Whitman spoke again, her voice low but firm, directed toward Reeves. "You will prepare a full incident account before the end of shift." And Reeves nodded immediately, his voice steady. "Yes, Captain." The response clear, without hesitation, without defense. And for the first time since the beginning of the encounter, his tone carried no attempt to justify, only to accept. Naomi glanced once toward him, not sharply, not with accusation, just a brief acknowledgement of his presence in the moment. And that glance seemed to settle something further, not absolution, not resolution, but recognition of shared space, of actions taken and consequences that would follow. The younger officer straightened slightly, his posture now fully aligned with the shift, his earlier uncertainty replaced by quiet attention, as if he was watching something he would carry forward long after the scene dissolved. The rain continued its steady rhythm, soft against metal and pavement, indifferent to rank, indifferent to correction, and the lights from the patrol car reflected in long streaks across the ground, less urgent now, more like remnants of something that had already passed. The man turned slightly toward Naomi again, his voice calm. "Transportation can be arranged if needed," he said, offering without imposing. And Naomi shook her head gently. "That will not be necessary." Her words simple, controlled, as if she preferred to leave the scene on her own terms, without adding anything more than what had already been said. Whitman inclined her head, acknowledging the decision, and stepped back another half-pace, her position now clearly supportive rather than directive. Reeves lowered his gaze for a brief moment, then lifted it again, his posture steady but altered, no longer anchored in assumption, but in awareness, and that difference was visible. Even in the smallest details, the way his hands rested, the way his shoulders held, the crowd began to shift slightly, not dispersing yet, but loosening, as if the tension that had drawn them in was beginning to release, replaced by something quieter, something reflective. Naomi took a small step forward, not away, not toward anyone in particular, just forward, reclaiming movement in a space that had tried to define her stillness. And as she did, the scene adjusted around her, not dramatically, not loudly, but with quiet respect that did not need to be announced. No one stopped her, no one spoke over her, and the moment held, steady, grounded, as if everything that needed to happen had already unfolded, leaving only the space for it to be understood. Naomi Carter did not hurry her next step. She moved with the same measured pace that had carried her through every second of the encounter, her shoes pressing lightly against the damp pavement as she passed the edge of the patrol car's shadow and into the open space of the street. And something about that movement, simple as it was, caused the entire scene to shift again, quieter this time, more internal, as if the moment was no longer about correction but about what remained after it. The crowd began to part without being told, a subtle widening of space that followed her path. Phones still raised but no longer angled for confrontation, now held with a kind of quiet curiosity, a recognition that what they had witnessed was not just an incident, but a reversal they did not fully have words for. Captain Laura Whitman watched her go for a brief second before turning back toward Reeves, her posture still composed but carrying a weight that had not been there before, and when she spoke her voice was lower, more deliberate. "This will be reviewed at every level," she said, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a fact placed clearly between them, and Reeves nodded once, the motion firm, his voice steady. Understood, without hesitation, without resistance, as if the acceptance had already settled into him. The man from the government sedan remained near the curb, his gaze following Naomi for a moment longer before shifting back to Whitman, and there was a brief exchange between them, quiet, controlled, words too low for the crowd to catch, but precise enough to carry significance, and Whitman inclined her head. Once in response, her expression tightening just slightly before returning to its composed state. The younger officer stood still, his earlier presence in the center of the moment now replaced by observation, his eyes following Naomi as she moved, not with confusion anymore, but with something closer to understanding, something that would not leave him easily. Naomi reached the edge of the sidewalk and paused, not because she needed to, but because the moment itself seemed to ask for it, and she turned her head just slightly, not fully back, just enough to take in the scene one last time. The patrol car, the officers, the flashing lights now less urgent, the crowd beginning to shift, and her gaze passed over them without judgment, without lingering, just acknowledgement. The rain continued its steady fall, soft against her coat, tracing quiet lines that caught the light in brief reflections before disappearing, and she drew in a slow breath, the air cool, grounding, real, before letting it out just as evenly. Behind her, Reeves shifted his stance again, the motion subtle but different from before, no longer about reclaiming control, but about standing correctly within what had happened. And when he looked toward Naomi, his expression carried no defensiveness, no attempt to justify, only a quiet recognition that something important had been missed until it was too late to avoid. Whitman stepped closer to him, her voice low, direct. "You will also submit a personal statement," she said, and Reeves nodded again. "Yes, Captain," the words coming more naturally now, as if the structure of accountability had already begun to replace the structure of assumption. The man from the sedan turned slightly, addressing both of them without raising his voice. "This will move quickly," he said, and there was no emphasis in his tone, no need for it, because the certainty of the statement carried everything it needed. The younger officer glanced between them, absorbing each word, each shift in posture, each moment of quiet correction, and something in his stance straightened further, not out of tension, but out of awareness, as if he understood that what he had seen would shape how he stood in moments like this from now on. Naomi lowered her gaze briefly to the pavement, then lifted it again toward the street ahead, her path clear, unobstructed, and she began to walk, not away from the scene, but forward through it, reclaiming movement in a space that had tried to define her stillness. And as she did, the crowd continued to part, the distance opening naturally, without resistance, without hesitation. No one called after her, no one tried to stop her, and the silence that followed her steps was not empty. It was full, filled with the weight of what had been revealed, what had been corrected, and what would continue long after she was gone. Reeves watched until she was several yards away, then lowered his gaze again, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his shoulders no longer rigid, but grounded in a way that felt heavier, more permanent, and Whitman remained beside him, her posture steady, her attention already turning toward the process that would follow. The reports, the reviews, the accountability that would extend beyond this street. The man from the sedan stepped back toward his vehicle, his role in the moment nearly complete, but the presence he brought remained, shaping the way everything else would unfold. Naomi continued forward, her figure gradually moving beyond the immediate frame of the flashing lights. The sound of her steps softened by the rain, and as she reached the far end of the block, she did not look back again, because there was nothing left behind that needed her attention, only a moment that had already done what it needed to do, quietly, precisely, without ever raising its voice. The rain did not stop when Naomi Carter reached the end of the block. It continued with the same steady rhythm, tapping softly against pavement and metal, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if the world had not shifted in the quiet space between a pair of cuffs closing and then opening again. And she walked forward without looking back, her pace even, her posture unchanged, disappearing gradually into the gray distance where the streetlights blurred into a muted glow. Behind her, the scene did not dissolve all at once. It loosened, piece by piece, the crowd beginning to break apart in slow, uncertain movements, phones lowering, conversations returning in hushed tones, each person carrying away a version of what they thought they had seen, though none of them fully understood it. Officer Daniel Reeves remained standing near the patrol car, the flashing lights still reflecting across the wet ground in long streaks of red and blue. But the urgency they once carried had faded, replaced by something quieter, something heavier, and he did not move immediately, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze fixed on the space Naomi had just left, as if trying to reconcile the difference between what he believed had happened and what actually had. Captain Laura Whitman stood beside him, her posture composed, her attention already shifting toward the process that would follow, the documentation, the review, the chain of accountability that extended far beyond this street. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, direct. "We begin now," she said, not raising it, not emphasizing it, because she did not need to, and Reeves nodded once, the motion firm, grounded, as if something inside him had settled into place, not comfort, not relief, but understanding. The younger officer stepped back toward the cruiser, his movements quieter now, more deliberate, as if he was aware of every detail in a way he had not been before. His eyes lingering for a second on the empty back seat, the space where Naomi had been, the absence of the cuffs now more significant than their presence had been earlier. The man from the government sedan closed his door with controlled precision, the sound soft but final, and he did not look back as he entered the vehicle, because there was nothing left in the moment that required his presence, only the continuation of what had already been set in motion. The engine started, low and steady, and the sedan pulled away without urgency, merging back into the quiet flow of the city, leaving behind a space that felt altered even as it returned to normal. Whitman turned slightly toward Reeves again, her gaze steady. "Your report will reflect everything," she said, and Reeves met her eyes briefly, his voice even. "It will," not offering explanation, not attempting to reshape what had occurred, only acknowledging the responsibility to record it as it was. The rain softened slightly, the drops lighter now, almost fading, and the sound of it against the patrol car became less pronounced, blending into the distant hum of traffic and the quiet murmur of a city continuing its routine. The crowd thinned further, people stepping away one by one, returning to their paths, their conversations, their assumptions, though something about their movements suggested that the moment would stay with them longer than they expected. Reeves finally looked down at his hands, turning them slightly as if seeing them differently, not because they had changed, but because the meaning of what they had done had. And he exhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, before lifting his gaze again, this time not toward the street, but toward Whitman, toward the next step, toward what would follow. The younger officer closed the rear door of the patrol car gently, the sound soft, deliberate, and he stood for a second with his hand resting against the metal, as if grounding himself in the reality of what had just happened, before stepping back. Whitman moved toward the front of the cruiser, her posture steady, her presence unchanged, but there was a quiet weight in the way she carried herself now, the kind that came from knowing that correction was only the beginning, that accountability would extend far beyond this moment, into reports, into reviews, into decisions that would not be made here, but would be shaped by what had happened here. Reeves followed her movement with his eyes, then took a step forward, not out of habit, not out of command, but out of alignment, as if he understood now that the next action mattered as much as the last. The lights on the patrol car continued to flash for a few seconds longer before Whitman reached inside and turned them off. And when they went dark, the street seemed to exhale, the colors fading back into the muted gray of the afternoon, the scene returning to something that looked ordinary again, though it no longer felt that way. In the distance, Naomi Carter's figure had already blended into the city, no longer visible, no longer part of the immediate frame, but the space she had occupied remained, not physically, but in the quiet shift that had taken place, in the understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. Reeves stood there for one last second, the rain barely falling now, the street almost still, and he realized something he had not considered before, something that did not come from the radio, or the screen, or the arrival of authority, but from the stillness itself. That respect was not something given after recognition. It was something owed before it, and the absence of it had already shaped everything that followed. Whitman turned back toward him, her voice calm, steady. "Let us move," she said, and this time when Reeves nodded, the motion carried no hesitation, only acceptance, and as they stepped forward together, the scene behind them finally settled into silence, the kind that did not erase what had happened, but held it quietly, like a truth that did not need to be repeated to remain understood.